Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation on school-police relations and the racial implications of it. My name is Jack McDevitt. I'm the director of the Institute for Race and Justice, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. This is going to be an important conversation. It's one that's happening in all of our communities, and I think we can add some information about it. We've long known that students who are expelled from school tend to have an increased likelihood of being arrested and an increased likelihood of being coming in contact with the juvenile justice system. In addition, we know from the research that students of color, African-American students and Latinx students, are more likely to be expelled than some of their white peers. What we know from that research is that zero tolerance programs in school tend to fall disproportionately on students of color. So we've had a number of developments that have happened, primarily around school shootings, where there's a call for more arms in school and more police officers in school. And we're seeing growth in the number of school resource officers who are assigned to schools. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the implications, both positive and negative, for having more police in schools, and I look forward to the conversation. First, it's my honor to introduce the director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northeastern, Amy Farrell. Amy's a good friend and also the first woman ever to serve as director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice here at Northeastern, which is a huge honor for us as a school. Amy's been involved with the Institute for Race and Justice from our very beginnings. She's been in there as we did racial profiling work in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. She was also a big part of the work that we did to try to fund a civilian oversight board for the Boston Police Department. Amy is also an internationally known and renowned expert in strategies to combat human trafficking, both in the United States and internationally. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Amy for some welcoming remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you for that introduction. And it's really great to see so many people here today. On behalf of the school and the College of Social Science and Humanities, I wanted just to take a chance to thank everyone for joining us for these conversations. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Lisa and Lucinda and Roxanne this afternoon about a topic that oftentimes moves to the side in our conversations right now around police accountability and violence by the police, but is incredibly important in terms of formative relationships of young people to institutions like policing and issues around legitimacy of the criminal justice system as a whole. So I'm honored to have this presentation happening under the co-sponsorship of both the Institute and the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and really looking forward to the engagement today. And I would like to thank Lisa for all of her work in terms of putting together this speaker series, this 4-part speaker series that's going to run throughout the year, that's engaging faculty members, students, members of the community, and our community advisory board in important conversations around race, justice, and policy. So I'll kick it back to Jack and really look forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks. Now it's my honor to introduce Harry Harding. Harry is the Vice President of Innovation and Strategic Partnerships at the Children's Services of Roxbury. It's a social service nonprofit in Boston that serves more than 6,000 individuals from across Massachusetts annually. His role is to cultivate external relationships like these that we're doing today and alliances while working closely with the executive team. He also oversees a long-running program at CSR, which is the Youth and Police Partnerships, where we're specifically talking about, he specifically was dealing with some of the issues that we're dealing with today, as a program where Boston police officers partner with young people to try to do projects that will bring the young people to a successful place in their career and school and everything. So I turn it over to Harry for some opening remarks.
Jack, thank you so much. Just want to check my audio. Is audio okay, everyone?
Yep.
All right, great. Again, thank you, Jack. Thank you to the IRJ and to Lisa for all the work organizing these series and for today's opportunity to speak. I wanted to really acknowledge the value of the dialogue, and particularly these types of forums that we're having, like this speak dialogue series. And I was kind of trying to think about, how I wanted to center that. And I had an experience last week that I thought would be helpful and relevant to this conversation. I teach a course on the side. I teach a course on leadership and community engagement, and we had a guest come in last week. And the gentleman's name is Vu Le, who some of you may be familiar with. Vu Le is a nonprofit leader based out on the West Coast, in Seattle, I believe. A Vietnamese man whose his nonprofit is committed to building leaders of color. In any case, he was a guest on our class last week, and we were talking about, really how nonprofits, particularly small nonprofits who have these great missions, how to best support them, right? Particularly now when we see all the need that's out there, and particularly talking about like a program like YPP, right, which is, as Jack mentioned, has been a long time running program, almost 25 years, but it's still very, very small in terms of its budget, in terms of its reach, and that's unfortunate. But I bring up Voulez because one of the students had asked him, so what do we do? How do we get nonprofits? How do we get small nonprofits like a YPP, like others who are doing great things? How do we actually get them competitive? What do we need to do? And Voulez didn't take a lot of time. He shot right back and he said, you need to get angry. And what he meant by that, and he went on to say, is that we have so many great missions, so many programs, like YPP, that have this such important can have such important reach, and we constantly find ourselves as leaders of these programs struggling for dollars, struggling for outreach, struggling for connection. And the problem with that is that we have to get angry. We have to get more upset about where it is, with the state of where our programs are. And it really started to resonate with me because I thought about it and I said, I am angry. I am angry at the fact that this program, which does such incredible work with young people and with the law enforcement community, doesn't get the level of recognition that it possibly could. It doesn't always get the type of resources that it possibly could. Beyond that, I'm angry in the situation that's happening in our social climate. I'm angry that, seemingly every other day on the news, a Black and brown person is killed or is injured or is confronted in a way that is problematic in the community when it comes to interacting with our law enforcement. And this anger, it's about channeling it in the right way, right? So it's one thing to be angry and destructive, but these types of forms that we're having, like this series, is a way for us to be angry and constructive, right? It's an opportunity for us to really use the intellectual capital, our shared resource, our shared understanding of the issue, our shared expertise, our shared care, and bring it to, again, a forum like this, a centralized forum where we really can talk solutions. Because the other piece is that we have to move through dialogue to action. And that's the other piece about YPP that I wanted to really kind of help rather bring to the forefront today, is that YPP is a program that has been long. One of the key features has been having dialogues, the young people having dialogues with law enforcement. And what we've been charged with, particularly now, again, with it being with the climate being so ripe for change, being so ready for young people and for those connected to those young people and for the law enforcement to work together towards solutions, we have to go from a place of moving through dialogue to action. And that's what I'm really happy and excited and encouraged to be a part of YPP and to help lead YPP and to be a part of programs like, efforts like this, is because I think that's where our best work comes out, because we'll never be able to compete with many programs that spend big, right? That have all these access to all these different resources. YPP may never be able to compete and spend big, but we can always think big. And that's why this, again, a forum like this, conversations like this are so key, because it allows us the critical opportunity to think big so that we can move again from dialogue to action. So Thank you again for allowing me to speak today, and I really look forward to continuing having these dialogues and to being fortunate enough to have these conversations with many of you who are on this call. So again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks very much. And we're fortunate to have you be associated with the Institute for Race and Justice and to help us continue to grow our connections in the community. Speaking of community connections, it's my pleasure to introduce the co-chair of our Community Advisory Board, Maddrey Goode. Maddrey's been the director of Mass Hire at the Boston Career Center, a one-stop career center operated by Morgan Memorial Goodwill Industries. As a director, Maddrey oversees and is responsible for the delivery of job placement and training services to the community. The Career Center serves 7,500 individuals, connecting job seekers with employers, places, and over 1,000 individuals per year. The other thing that Maddrey has been really generous with his time is to co-direct the Community Advisory Board for the Institute of Race and Justice. He's really been a phenomenal leader in the Community Advisory Board. He's been through all of the projects that we've had together. He continues to be a voice for the community, saying, well, how is this research going to impact the community? How is it going to help the community? And I think his voice is so important, and we learn from him in every meeting. The other thing that Maddrey does for us, and you'll probably see it here tonight, is with the conversations that Harry was talking about and Amy was talking about, they're difficult, they're hard conversations. And Maddrey keeps the conversations going with his goodwill and with his humor. He's always able to, in a nice, positive way, challenge a conversation, make it a little bit more engaging, and continue to move us towards a place where we can get to a resolution. So I truly enjoy working with Maddrey, and I'll turn it over to him now.
Thank you, Jack. And I want everyone to just take a minute and reflect on what folks have said. I just want to take a minute to, on behalf of the Community Advisory Board, to thank the members of the board. We have some on the chat today, and some will be on the panel as well. I also want to thank my co-chair, Sam Williams, who's not with us this evening, but is always with us in spirit. And I want to thank the community. They're the place that where, as you define community, is where your heart is. And as I define community is where my heart is. And my heart and my head and my space is actually in Roxbury. So I have an opportunity not only work where I grew up and lived and went to college at Northeastern. So it's a pleasure for me. My goal and my role today is to really moderate the conversation along with Jack. We have a presenter, and then we have two panelists who will join the presenter. And then we'll get into some Q&A. I want to first start by thanking Lisa Thurau. She is the Executive Director of Strategies for Youth, which she founded in 2009. It's a nonprofit that providing advocacy and training organizations to improve police and youth interactions, particularly those who are have a lot of unnecessary contact with law enforcement. She's also nationally known for providing training, and was also consulted by the U.S. Department of Justice as well as the U.S. Department of Education. Prior to forming Strategies for Youth from 1999 to 2008, Lisa served as a policy specialist and then as the Managing Director of the Juvenile Justice Center at Suffolk Law School. And prior to that, she is a graduate of Barnard College and holds a master's degree in anthropology from Columbia University, and graduated from the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law at the Yeshiva University in 1991. Before becoming an attorney, Lisa worked as a researcher and advocate for reform and improvement of the public education system in New York. So, as you can see, Lisa Thurau brings a lot of experience, but more importantly, one of the things that we want to do today is really support the research that she is going to provide us context with. And as we move through to the next panelist, we'll kind of get into the themes, but really Lisa's here really to start the conversation and inform us all based upon the conversations and the many years of research she's had and the impact. So I want to thank you, Lisa, and turn it over to you at this time.
Thank you very much, Maddrey. I appreciate it. And Jack and Lisa, I'm delighted to join the series and meet you, Dr. Farrell, who I've heard of so long and so favorably. Thank you for inviting me to speak today about race and school resource officers and the relationships. Because I've been asked to kind of sketch the dimensions of this topic, I thought what I would do is begin by telling you my thesis of what's happened with the involvement of law enforcement in schools, and then speak a little bit more to the history and the 5 W's, why, where, when, who, and how school policing has led to some of the impacts we have seen. This is a topic that is incredibly well documented, and there's much you can read about it. We have tried to summarize a lot of the articles on our website, where we have an annotated bibliography we invite you to look at. So here's my sense of what's happened in the last 30 years with school police. In the rush to place school resource officers, or SROs, in public school systems, there was little planning, little forethought or consideration given to how individuals steeped in a law enforcement culture would acclimate to institutions with a mission to socialize and educate children. Police officers are primarily trained to interact with youth as victims or as perpetrators. Schools, on the other hand, are highly regulated arenas mandated to focus on achieving successful student outcomes. Most law enforcement officers arrive with little knowledge of school protocols or of special laws protecting youth with special needs. Immediately, this lack of planning and clarity caused confusion, lawsuits, and high rates of student arrests, often for minor offenses that would not have been considered criminal in the past. Dissension ensued. Schools and law enforcement fought, parents and law enforcement sued each other, and communities and schools came at each other too. Acknowledging that placing school resource officers in schools generated negative consequences, and some positive ones too, including an increase in the flow of students of color and with disabilities, is what led to the coinage of the term, the school to prison pipeline. Now, if we are to look at, if you could move to the next slide there. If we're to look at this in the context of policing historically, I don't know if someone could help me move that. There we go. Strategies for Youth, which is a national nonprofit and training organization, is dedicated to equipping officers with best practices for working with youth and reducing disproportionate minority contact. And we were formed to work with patrol officers, but have increasingly been asked to work with school resource officers. We do training for law enforcement. We do a lot of outreach work, like the Juvenile Justice Jeopardy game, which we've done with YPP and the Children's Services of Roxbury over the years, among many other programs, and in Boston. And we do a lot of policy and research on original structural factors that impede progress in this domain. Today, we work in about 20 states. I think it's first important to put all that we're going to talk about into context. Schools are microcosms. They are embedded in communities and embedded in jurisdictions which are legal and legally determined in many ways. And they're part of states that have particular funding and legal policies. Similarly, policing youth outside of schools is notably often lacking in a clear mandate. Do we want police to treat youth differently than adults? Some places do. Few have visions articulating that. Most law enforcement officers in America have no training to work with youth at the law enforcement academy or thereafter. Few law enforcement agencies have developmentally appropriate, trauma-informed, racially equitable policies to guide law enforcement interactions with youth and to fetter their discretion. And generally, there's little oversight about what's going on with police and youth. And law enforcement is part of the general culture. And so what law enforcement has been demonstrated to show is that many of its officers are just completely unaware of transgenerational trauma, especially among African-American youth, from the history of enforcing racism. And many law enforcement are completely unaware of their biases regarding people of color. And they are very much disposed to see that youth of color act intentionally all the time and are much less willing to consider that youth of color have a mental health issue or some sort of behavior that may not reflect intentional misconduct or intentional wrongdoing. The absolute abnegation of whether or not law enforcement has racist tendencies, like every other institution in the United States, from education to orchestras, has been dramatic this year, especially with the introduction more broadly of the terms of systemic racism. Here are just a couple of headlines of different folks in rather majorly important positions, including Attorney General Barr, denying that systemic racism exists in law enforcement and in any other system either. We know systemic racism exists within schools as well as in law enforcement. So in that context, it's also important to look at the status of public schools, especially when we saw an influx of school resource officers. Historically, there's been inequitable funding. And there was in the 1990s a dramatic tendency to defund and privatize public schools, which was a long time coming. And schools, the public schools had increased obligations with less funding and support, and often had perverse incentives to get rid of kids. Poorly performing kids were not doing most schools any favors and put them at risk of receivership. So, excuse me, if you look at the history of school resource officers, they became very popular in the 1990s and 2000s, but they've been around since the 1950s. Since school desegregation started being considered and people wanted to make sure order was maintained. Here's a movie I recommend you all watch, Blackboard Jungle from 1955 with Glenn Ford and Sidney Poitier, that shows you how little has changed in the way we view youth who are non-conforming. In 1994, excuse me, the Federal Safe and Drug-Free Schools Act led to increased presence of school resource officers and a perception of schools as being dangerous places that needed regulation by law enforcement. And then this was really hitting its pinnacle in 1998 with the Columbine shootings. And since then, many other shootings, leading to the perception that we needed school resource officers in the public schools. Now, since we're talking about race, it's worth noting that the vast majority, 95% of school shooters are white teenage boys. You can start in 1998 and go to the most recent ones. The vast majority are white males. And the vast response of federal and state agencies was to arm the schools, to protect schools from increased shootings. Now, having worked in the New York City school systems as a researcher in the 1980s, the presence of school police officers was to keep people out who presented a danger. As of the late 1990s, we started to see a change in that. First of all, we saw that sworn officers were being sent into the public schools. And you can see from this map here, this chart, that the community-oriented policing services programs really peaked in the amount of federal funding given in 2002 to putting school resource officers in the nation's public schools, with grants exceeding 127 million. By 2011, that amount of money had decreased dramatically, but it is going up again. Well, you might ask yourself, why did we respond to school shooting with school resource officers if there are not that many school shootings and now very many school resource officers? Well, I think it is an American cultural predilection to view things through a criminal lens. So surely the behavior of the two young men in Columbine was violent and criminal. But to persist with that criminal lens led to an increase in the Americans' default response, which is we need to fight this, we need to declare a war on it. Yet that's not the terminology we heard when it was discussed. It was, we're going to keep youth safe, but the questions remain, which youth, how, and at what cost? So it's always important to ask what's the initial objective to see how far you've hewed to it. And initially it was truly understandably to stop violence. You know, if you noticed a kid walking into your school with the long gun, you would want to keep them out. And we were trying to keep young people safe. We were trying to reduce guns and drugs at a time when the exponential increase in availability of guns and drugs was overwhelming us. And we were all around trying to keep danger out. And so terms like zero tolerance, which you hardly hear anymore, were bandied about as the best way to keep anything dangerous out of our nation's public schools. And so the initial perception of law enforcement's role at that point was an officer whose goal was to keep danger out, and there was an outward looking position. But what we saw increasingly since then was officers looking inside the school and using law enforcement responses inside the school. What's the SRO's role? Well, on the left, you see a 2018 survey of SROs done by Education Week, and they said it's about enforcing school safety and security. A much smaller number said mentoring or teaching, and about 33% said other tasks and weren't very clear. But this compounded with what law enforcement said earlier in 2011, showing, I'm quoting you there, Jack, what was expected of them and how they spent their time in the schools. And you can tell it's gone increasingly towards law enforcement, up from the 48% Jack and his colleague Peter Finn noted in 2011. And as usual, when we have expectations, they are often in one side of the world and reality is in another. And how our expectations of what officers would do to protect our kids got very much sabotaged, or let's say embroiled in reality and complexities. Now today, I am not going to talk about individual SROs, and I am not going to opine on whether or not they're good SROs or bad SROs. To be sure, there are many of both. I have had the pleasure of meeting many fabulous SROs who I would call lifesavers, and I've met some who shouldn't be in the public schools or maybe dealing with people anywhere. We're going to look at the systemic factors that have led to extreme racial disparities here. And one of the key ones is location, location, location. So we knew why the officers were placed in schools, but then when we saw where they were placed in schools, we started to see a very different kind of objective and reality take place. First, they were uniformly placed in urban areas where there were predominantly poor youth and youth of color, and school systems that used exclusionary discipline. And when I say exclusionary discipline, I mean suspension, expulsion, and they promoted use of arrest by their SROs, sometimes in direct contradiction to what SROs wanted to do with kids. And their goal was to remove those kids from the public school systems that they felt were hampered by these youth. It's also important to think about who was paying. In Massachusetts, for example, and my comments today are looking at this globally across the US, but now and then I'll talk about Massachusetts. You have some places where it's solely the municipal law enforcement agency that is paying for the placement of officers in public schools. I can tell you that is reducing and being reduced dramatically. Increasingly, we're seeing school districts footing the entire bill of the pay for school resource officers. And in some place, you'll see a combination of the law enforcement agency and the school district. And now and then you'll see all of it being undergirded or supported and supplemented by federal funds under the community-oriented policing services funding. But let's look at use and funding for a moment. The national averages show that there is one counselor to about 482 students, which is remarkable in a time when we believe college entry is so important, and guidance counselors are key navigators for that. And it's even more remarkable when we look at how few school nurses there are to students. So the funding of school resource officers necessarily came at the expense of funding for other services for youth, which is now a key issue. In fact, there only are 3 states in America that have met the recommended student to counselor ratio, and even fewer that have met the student to school nurse ratio. And the 3 states that have met it are states with very low population rates. But now you're seeing a great push across America to have counselors, not cops, in the schools, because in addition to having fewer funds for public schools generally, what funds were there were further decreased by hiring school resource officers. So as students have less access to support services, more money is being spent on officers to learn basic child and adolescent care skills. And a lot of people are questioning whether or not that is the best quid pro quo for an educational dollar. In fact, Senator Warren, Representative Presley, Senator Murphy, and Representative Omar have filed Senate Bill 4360 in the US Congress that would block more federal funds through the COPS office to be spent for school resource officers. Let's look for a minute at who are SROs. Everybody thinks a school resource officer is imbued with certain powers, when in fact they have radically different powers. Sworn officers, that means an officer who's working for a municipal police department or a sheriff's agency, are officers that are called school resource officers in most places. They may also be part of a school police department, and certain states like Texas have very large school police departments, which are their own law enforcement agencies, subject to the laws and with all the authority and powers of a police officer. Then you have non-sworn officers, and these are sometimes called school police, as we have them in Boston. They are not sworn officers. They do not have the right to arrest. They do have the right to detain. And they are kind of neither fish nor fowl. To make an arrest, they must call a sworn officer from the Boston Police Department, for instance. Then we see security staff who carry no guns or cuffs. These officers often handle things like the monitors to see if you're carrying a weapon inside the school, and they often are equipped with walkie-talkies. In some places like Columbus, Ohio, you see folks taking this position that's neither a non-sworn officer nor a security staff, and doing a phenomenal job of being school safety specialists who work with kids and who are from the neighborhoods where kids are from and know how to speak with them. But what you're finding across the United States typically now is some combination of various forms of law enforcement or security personnel working with youth. Who is selected is the $64 question, and it's usually not a question that police departments or school agencies are willing to answer. They also do not involve the community. And so we have no clue often what screening these officers are given, if they have any special aptitude. We know that some officers really like it because of the schedule, and that in some places there's a really strong effort to prohibit those with longevity in a union from being the ones who get the school resource officer job because the schedule is so pleasant. We see a lot of new officers being placed in schools, and in some disturbing situations in different parts of this country. We have seen officers who proved to be so dangerous on the streets being put in the schools instead for reasons that I find baffling. There are also a fair number of road officers, that's retired on active duty officers, who are seen as taking a job that may better be assigned to someone younger, but I have seen some of them be transformed as going from someone who's kind of retired and just hanging out there to very active, grandfatherly type figures in some school settings. When Education Week looked at SROs, they found that about 75% reported working with youth before becoming an SRO, and that the #1 training most of them had received was in active shootings. Very few had received training in anything else that we at Strategies for Youth think would be helpful when working with kids. And so if that's the where and the why and the who, the question becomes how. And basically SROs were told, just do it. If you look at policies for most law enforcement agencies, you're not going to see any definition of the role or what officers should or shouldn't do. And so the first question meeting most SROs was, who's the boss, the school principal or the chief of the police department? And for many SROs, it's an uneasy position to be squunched between the two of them, between a rock and a hard place. Typically, principals determine how an SRO behaves, and if that relationship does not go well, the SRO does not last. And the principal will often assert an exclusionary or an inclusionary approach. Historically, there have been huge arguments between school systems and law enforcement, with some school systems saying, we don't want you in our schools, and law enforcement insisting they should be that way. And in fact, in Massachusetts, it's a state statute that an SRO must be in the public schools until this current bill with policing is decided that's how it will be. Communities rather rarely had any say in how the SRO would act or what the SRO would do. And then you had states making legal mandates about what an SRO was mandated to do when they saw certain offending. The National Association of School Resource Officers had a vision that officers would be 1/3 of the time enforcing the law, 1/3 of the time being a counselor, and 1/3 of the time being an educator in the public schools, or a three-legged stool, which raised some rather troubling aspects for kids when they confided in officers in a way that risks leading to their arrest, or having the officers as mandated reporters take matters into legal hands. The lack of policies is just kind of dramatic across the United States, but the key issue for school resource officers is, what are they there for? Are they disciplining the kid who didn't take their hats off, like we saw in Springfield, Massachusetts, or are they there to stop crime? And how do they work between those two? Should they be silent when they see a kid misbehaving in the halls? If they are silent, does that tell the kid they can do whatever they want and it escalates the kid's behavior until it becomes an offense? Nobody has been or is clear about how you draw the line between discipline and offending, but it is clear to me that the pendulum has swung towards understanding that school resource officers should not be involved in school discipline, not for talking back to teachers, not for failing to take your hat off, not for walking around in the hallways. That is not what they're there for. It is problematic, however, that we don't always know what they are there for, and we don't know what the policies are that direct them to take action one way or another. We don't know, for instance, in what most school resource officers' policies are for using restraints, and that can be cuffs or shackles or other sources of restraint. We don't know what their use of force policies are in public schools, or whether or not they should call ICE or the Department of Homeland Security, as happened in Boston a couple of years ago, and that's happening across the United States. We're not even sure what their obligation is to notify parents, much less what they're allowed to access regarding records. And this continues to be debated across the United States, as well as in Massachusetts, when there's rejection of things like the state attorney general's very excellent model MOU, or model memorandum of understanding between law enforcement and schools, where key legal points continue to be negotiated because district attorneys in the state have decided that that model MOU was not something that necessarily worked for law enforcement in their districts. Worse, a lot of these policies are not publicly available. I've worked with folks in Texas and in Tennessee that have had to sue to find out what policies school resource officers are using on their kids. So in view of that, we created a checklist for school resource officers in schools so that parents could ask questions to understand what could happen to their children. The how was also answered by the fact that since 2015, 22 states now require SROs to be trained. But remarkably, they are very limited in what the training should be.
Lisa, could I just ask that, this is incredibly important, but just so we have time for everybody to talk, could you just, great, thank you.
I'm sorry. You can see how little required folks to be trained in de-escalation, adolescent development, mental health, or trauma informed, and only 9 states even require training on special education laws. So Massachusetts, I have to say that since the MPTC cannot compel attendance at any of its trainings to date, whether or not an SRO is trained depends on the wealth of the district because it costs to send officers to training. We'll see what happens with the new law. So you also have to look at schools here, and schools want some officers to be robo-cops, right? And they don't have policies for when their teachers can call police into classrooms. They don't articulate or require officers to deal with mental health or other systems. And there's no integrated training between teachers and SROs. And so while some principals want the officers to be the heavy or the RoboCop, other school systems really want officers to be lifesavers. And I have seen them be both and do really well at both too. So when we look at impacts, and I'm down to my last 2 minutes, we can see some really key things. Strategies for Youth and Citizens for Juvenile Justice published a report. We have 2 different headings for it. I'm focusing more on its national implications in our cover, but what we found was the impacts are increased suspension and expulsion, dramatic increase in arrests and therefore system involvement, increased use of force and lawsuits, and increased media coverage. Criminalization of school discipline, which leads to disconnecting kids from schools and opportunities, has been what's happened in the last 25 years. 3.5 times as many arrests since the schools had no school resource officers. And you should know that every arrest increases dropout rates dramatically. Who's bearing the brunt of this? Well, in view of the fact that it was youth who were shooting up schools that was the reason for putting police in schools, it's disturbing to know that these white youth who were doing the shootings are not the ones primarily affected by school resource officers. It's youth of color who are. They're more likely to be suspected and targeted. They're stopped and challenged, threatened with arrest. They have fewer weapons, but are more likely to be arrested. And all in all, white youth are treated better. And this is what I hear from SROs who protest some of the school leaders they work with. The Massachusetts numbers, which are hard to get because we have a hard time getting the Department of Early Education and School and Education to always report the information, shows that Black boys are at the highest risk in Massachusetts, and this is true across the country. So are Black girls. And when you look at some of the data from Massachusetts Appleseed, you see that Black and brown students are disproportionately targeted for arrests, and that is often where the officers are. So they're going to be more disciplined, more expelled, and more arrested. And while they're in the news, it doesn't seem to change officers' use of force or restraints on very young children and using them routinely. I also want to add that there's a psychological toll to the placement of school resource officers. 3 studies in New York City showed that there was decreased grades, increased emotional disturbance, mostly anxiety, and lower long-term education prospects, as well as a reduction in completion of school and college attendance. And it's important to remember how trauma and distress derail educational success. So my last 2 points are here, in view of the fact that so many of these officers were placed in schools due to school shootings, how well did the presence of SROs really decrease school shootings? Well, Not very much. The Washington Post found that over 200 school shootings, 2 were derailed by school resource officers who intervened successfully. They also found, and others have found this too, and that's written up in our reports, that crimes don't decrease. And the school climate does not necessarily improve when SROs are in schools either. So our necessary questions are, is a cure worse than the problem? If SROs appear to undermine educational equity, should they be removed? And who should decide what's the most important priority for students? Safety from school shooters or safety from higher rates of system involvement for their children? I think those are the topics that we're facing today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Turn it over to Maddrey again.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that thorough and really, really important framing the conversation from a local and national perspective. And so when we talked and put this together, it was interesting how we kind of came to agreement that the frame was important, and just as important was sort of the supporting the youth and the families, and then supporting the community and young adults. So we have 2 panelists that I want to introduce. The first is Lucinda Mills. Lucinda Mills is a district social worker, school adjustment counselor in the Behavioral Health Services Department in Boston Public Schools. Lucinda provides counseling, case management, social skills groups, home visits, and trainings in her role with students, families, and teachers. Before that, she worked as a court clinician in Cambridge and Waltham Juvenile Court and at the Common Square Health Center as a psychotherapist. She's a trainer for Safety Care De-escalation program, which is used in schools, Second Step social skills curriculum, and CBITS trauma training. Lucinda is a member of the Boston Teachers Union, Restorative Justice Committee, and Social Emotional Learning Committee. She has been involved with the Institute for 18 years since its beginning. So Lucinda will have a great perspective on working with the students and supporting those families, as well as we have Roxanne Longoria, serves as the Director of Youth Homeless Initiatives in the Mayor's Office of Health and Human Services for the City of Boston. In this role, Roxanne is part of the implementation team to execute Boston's Rising to the Challenge, a collaborative action plan to prevent and end youth and young adult homelessness in Boston. The plans includes action steps designed to meet the housing, education, employment, health, and social emotional needs of Boston's youth and young adults. Passionate about impacting lives for the better, Roxanne is very civically engaged and involved in the community. She currently serves on the board for Northeastern University of Race and Justice, as well as ESAC Boston, in the Massachusetts Workforce Alliance. In 2015, she was recognized by El Planeta in the Power Meter 100 list of the 100 most influential people for Latinos. Roxanne holds a bachelor's degree in biomedical science and a master's in public health with a concentration in social and behavioral health from Texas A&M University. All right, so what I'm gonna ask is Lucinda, we would love your perspective based upon what you just heard and based upon your work.
Hey, hi everyone. Hello everyone.
Hi, Lucinda.
Hi. So let me pick up where Lisa left on. She made some really good points from the part about SROs being used in schools a lot after school shootings, to the role of SROs in terms of providing school safety, schools security. But the question we need to ask is, does having SROs in our schools make our schools quote unquote safe? When we're looking at school safety, we need to look at the whole child. And when we look at the whole child, we need to think about emotional safety. We need to think about physical safety. We need to think about academic safety, as well as health and medical safety, which is even more crucial in the middle of a pandemic. She also gave us some really great stats, but one of the statistics that is out there is that 1 in 4 US schools have zero school counselors in 1 in 4 US schools. And 90% of students are attending schools that do not meet the recommended national standard ratios in terms of schools, in terms of student to professional ratios. So for example, 1 school social worker for 250 students, 1 school psychologist for every 500 students, and 1 school counselor for every 250 students, which is by the national groups, the National Association of School Psychologists, as well as the National Association of School Social Workers. So according to the National Alliance of Mental Illness, NAMI states that 1 in 5 children ages 13 to 18 have or will have a serious mental illness. 10% of youth have a behavior or conduct disorder. Why is that important? This is important in this conversation because of the fact that a lot of times school police are responding because of behavioral difficulties or behavioral concerns that staff members are calling them for. A lot of times students are being labeled violent, they're being labeled disruptive, and a lot of times they're calling school police to intervene in those type of situations in terms of instead of the counselor, the social worker, the school psychologist. We also need to remember a lot of our students have diagnoses, they have disabilities, they're receiving special education services, and they're not walking around with signs that says, I have anxiety, I have a parent at home with substance use, my dad just got deported last night. So a lot of times we're seeing the behavioral presentation of students. And we also have to remember in clinical training, many times those trainings are not done with a cultural lens. So they're not looking at the cultural presentation of a lot of our Black students. So when we learn about depression, we're learning that kids are sad, kids are crying. But in many Black males, that depression, that sadness is in anger, it's in our behavior presentation, and many times we're not intervening correctly. So in Boston, we have approximately 76 school psychologists. We have about 50 something school social workers. And myself, I work with 7 district social workers. So we work district-wide and in the Behavioral Health Services Department. What has been helpful, we do partner with Boston School Police. And when there is incidents that involve mental health concerns, the school police will reach out to our department for help and support. The school police in Boston Public Schools, they also have what we call a intervention prevention assistant director, and that person helps to coordinate resources. So if there's an incident that happens at a school or happens in the community and it impacts a BPS student or various BPS schools, we help coordinate resources and support services to send into the schools. But we need to also look at the fact that is having school police in our schools reinforcing the school to prison pipeline. When we look at suspension rates, when we look at zero tolerance policies, when we look who's impacted, who is affected, we know there's an overrepresentation of Black males in special education. We know the arrests are higher for Black and Latino males. But we also need to pay attention to the systems put in place from the school level to the district level, to the state level, to the federal level, and ask ourselves, what support services, what resources, what interventions are we providing to help keep not some students, but all of our students safe? And that's what we need to look at. In addition to what type of trainings are we providing SROs, kind of like what Lisa pointed out in her presentation. Are they receiving mental health trainings? Are they receiving trauma trainings? Are they helping to build relationships with students? Are they helping or are they harming our school climate. So we need to look at the overall picture when we're talking about school police or SROs in school and what's the impact on our students.
Thank you very much, Lucinda. Thank you for your comments. More importantly, thank you for your work with these families and community, and helping us with the advisory board to be laser about our focus in supporting these issues. Next up, Roxanne Longoria. You heard her bio. She has done a lot that we didn't mention in the bio around the prison to school pipeline and dismantling that. So if you could give us some words and some remarks, Roxanne, we'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure, of course. So thank you all for having me here today just to share some thoughts with you and some experience that I have from the Boston Youth Service Network. So today I wanted to share with you just a little bit of what my experience was in coordinating the Boston Youth Service Network focus around the school to prison pipeline. And of course, right before I came on, my computer shut down, so my notes went off, but we're just gonna go off. So the Boston Youth Service Network is a network of 15 community-based organizations that serve young people who haven't found success in traditional high school systems. So that means that they are in, give me 1 second and I can actually fix this. Okay. So that means that they are in GED programs, they're in career exploration programs, and they are needing a little bit more support services to find success in these traditional high school systems. The way that the network works together is it's 15 organizations that support youth across Boston with all of these different components. And the way that we focused on restorative justice on the school to prison pipeline in 1 year is by looking at the network focus, which was the adults, and then we had the youth council, which was representative of each of the 15 organizations with the young person. And so what I found interesting in the way that this came up in different ways in working with both adults and young people is that young people might not have the language or the vocabulary to describe the school to prison pipeline. They might not know the data, but they know how they feel within the schools, and they know how they feel around a police presence. And so what was wonderful about this work and getting to work directly with the young people was to hear their stories and to share the data and the research with them, and then help them to come along with a narrative, with a message, to share their story, to make a difference. And so within the network and the adults, what we focused on was restorative justice training with Suffolk University. Another interesting thing about the adults is when we started talking about these issues and we started talking about the school to prison pipeline, what came up was hidden disabilities. What came up was homelessness. Teachers started talking about young people who had compounding identities and who were going through multiple issues in their everyday life. And so then we're coming to school and needed somebody who could talk to them, who could relate to them. It's interesting because when I did the restorative justice training with the entire network, one of the providers is from Germany originally. And so we would always joke about US customs versus international customs and how we are touchy. We're more, of course, not now with COVID, but we're more huggy. And so this was a conversation that we would have within the network meeting normally. And her reflection on the training for restorative justice was, and she was always very blunt too, was I feel like we were in middle school at a campfire and we were all learning how to talk to each other more appropriately. And in preparation for this talk, I went and I pulled the seminar that we did with the network. And it is a lot of listening, being quiet, and understanding where the other person is coming from. And it is not about punitive justice. It's about restoring a relationship when harm has happened. And so when you think about who the strong and supportive adults are in the school system, such as SROs, it's really dependent on the individual person and the training that they receive and how much understanding of the experience of the young person coming into the school can they empathize with, and how can they talk to the young person. And so within the network, we started to think about SROs and talk about their presence in the school. And the young people in their work started to identify that there were SROs who had less patience than others, but then there were our SROs who were really wonderful mentors and connections, who became that person for the young, for a young person more than the administration. And young people started to talk about them in that school and saying that it was a better school because of the way that they treated the young people. So the young people, what they came up with was, again, the adults were doing the trainings and the young people came up with the Unity Handbook. And so the Unity Handbook is understanding, not incarcerating the youth. And so understanding was young people teaching, in my experience, what I'm going through, what these compounding identities of a hidden disability or experiencing homelessness could have on what my experience is like every day in the classroom. And then not incarcerating gave data. So educating folks on the numbers that Lucinda was mentioning. And also educating the young people themselves, because when you educate them, they become better advocates for themselves. And so letting them know that they have rights and that these things are happening, at this level, but that they can advocate for themselves, and that this is the language that you can use in these situations to help yourself be heard. And so I think by using those tools, which was the training for the adults and then young people being able to tell their story themselves and giving the data to back that up, and then empowering young people to, we did training, but it was empowering young people to present to the network one thing that was very important to them. And it was that some of them didn't want to be called, this sounds silly, but babies. So whenever people are talking about young people and they're saying, oh, these are my babies, or this is my class, making sure that they felt more empowered as young adults and calling them young adults in that way and empowering them in those situations. And so, I think my take on this is that we all talk about these issues, and we talk about SROs and the school to prison pipeline and restorative justice training at an adult level, but it's also very helpful to talk about this with young people themselves and to empower them to share their own story, because it's those stories that really change the minds of adults so that they can understand the bigger picture of what a young person might be going through.
So I want to thank the panelists and the presenter for their comments. I want to acknowledge what I heard. It's not a question of good, bad, or indifferent, but a lot of it revolves around training and the scarcity of resources overall. I've done a lot of work in my past doing fatherhood training, co-parenting training, but one of the things that training doesn't necessarily always address is in the moment in us as humans, because I've been trained well, but there's sometimes my 15-year-old daughter can say things to me and I forget my training instantly and go into that place of where I want to be protective, but then training helps me to not only recognize that, but apologize. And I'm going to end with, I feel like you can't train love, but you can get to some aptitude. And just from a workforce development perspective, it's very important that we don't demonize school resource officers or police, because someone brought it to my attention. If you want people from the community to hold these positions, you have to understand at an early age, you have to make it attractive for them to understand that this is something viable for them as well. And so it always keeps me in the space of being positive. But really part of this dialogue is hearing from the group. So I'm gonna work with us to figure out who may wanna ask a question, and then open it up for the panelists or anybody who made introductory remarks to respond to that. So. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Jordan. You're still muted, Jordan.
Okay, now sorry, the host had to let me unmute. Hi, I'm Jordan Clark. I'm a graduate student applying to a PhD in personal health informatics, quantifying physiological effects of microaggressions. Thank you so much, panelists, for speaking at the intersection of all of these issues. And I, as this Black man with invisible disability, PTSD, my experiences with campus police, and as a former teacher, I was curious if you could speak more on the restorative justice and the, I think Roxanne really spoke about narrative medicine, that power, but like, are there models that you've seen that have been successful? And if so, what, like, outside of like the individual person that I call you, like if it's a good person there, it's good, but like policy wise or examples that people could look to, I think as it relates to restorative justice and that healing aspect, anybody?
Thank you, Jordan. Roxanne or Lucinda?
I was gonna shift it to Lucinda to maybe have the larger focus at BPS. I'll say for us, thinking about training in general, and this might be a little bit of a touchy subject, but you know, I was reading a little bit about the police reform bill that just you know, went back to legislation by Governor Baker. And I think that's one piece in there that I'm thinking more about. One piece in there is who gives the training for police officers. And I know for him, he's very much thinking or that it needs to be from the highest court and that it needs to be internal and not a community-based training. I think we should probably be empowering community members to also do presentations and trainings for police officers, even young people, to be able to give those trainings so that, it's coming straight. An experience is always taken more from the person who's experiencing it, and also the school to prison pipeline has a lot more long-term effects than just the one thing that could be happening in the school. It could set a young person up for a lifetime of interactions that they didn't need to have at all because of something very small in the beginning. And so for me, it's really important to think about how can the voices of the people who were impacted by SROs be informing those policy decisions and also the training that's given to them.
And I think that it is unfortunate that it's being bifurcated into it's either police to train police or community that trains police. And as you're suggesting, a model that brought both together might be much more effective. Lucinda, Lisa?
So I can speak from the Boston Public Schools end. We have some restorative justice coaches working in the district, not enough. We had to advocate for these positions. I believe our last contract, we got like 4 restorative justice coaches, which were in district of 125 schools. That's like minor. However, we do have a lot of schools who did the training on their own through Suffolk's university. We do hold a lot of circles when incidents come up at specific schools for crisis, for different reasons. I would say in terms of my experience at 2 schools that did restorative justice, one where the teacher allowed the students to choose the topic every single week, and it worked really, really well, to the point that I remember a student that I had in the class that I was pulling for counseling was like, why are you taking me? This was the time that the teacher said it was okay. And then this student then said, I am not missing restorative justice. This is important. And I'm like, I totally agree with you. But for me, it was so important to see that a student found the value of in terms of the circles and that she was getting so much from the circle process. And then at another school, I know one of the restorative justice practitioners had trained his students to actually lead the circles. So they knew the process and knew what to do when something happens. And I had another experience. Part of my role, we respond to crisis situations in the district all the time. It could be the death of someone. It can be an actual incident that happened. I remember showing up at a school and a staff member had died and students were having a hard time. And a student said, let's do a circle. And they had already had the circle practice. They knew what to do. They knew the talking piece and they knew how to set it up. So we as the adults just kind of, okay, let's do this, and did it. So I would say we have several schools in the district who are using the restorative justice model effectively. We don't have enough. We need a whole lot more training in the district, and we do need a lot more restorative justice coaches and trainers in the district, but we do have some.
I would just like to jump in about restorative justice and training generally. I think restorative justice is much more developmentally appropriate, trauma-informed, and racially equitable than the juvenile justice system. Of course, there are some problems always with implementation of any program, and human discretion can affect who gets picked for RJ and who gets sent and referred to the police. But restorative justice deals with an issue immediately, which is time appropriate. It has a consequence that's typically better proportional to the issue at hand. And the language used to discuss it involves the language of the person who's harmed much more than you would ever see in a court. And I could go on about the importance of RJ, which is being used across the country. I mean, in Oregon, every county has an obligation to implement restorative justice practices for all disputes for any matter. So I guess we have to move west to try that. As for training, I wanted to say 2 things. One is I couldn't agree with Roxanne more. We must involve young people in our trainings. When we do trainings as Strategies for Youth, we interview youth, we interview officers and system stakeholders before we do a training to get an assessment, as much a 360-degree assessment as possible. But then we always involve youth in skits at the end of the training with the opportunity for them to speak openly about hypothetical situations, and then to do some role reversal. And that's when we hear officers say, that's when the light bulb went off. So I could not agree with you more. I love the idea of this Unity handbook and hope to read it and post it on our website as a best practice. The last thing I want to say is one of the things we hear persistently from school resource officers or school police officers is, don't stop training with us. You got to train the teachers. You got to train the administrators. I wish I had $1, arguably $100 for every time I've had a police officer say to me, I had to explain to the principal that a kid with Down syndrome is really not responsible for their behavior. Or I wish I could have a $100 bill from the number of times that I heard from school police officers in the Boston Public Schools that they fought with teachers who wanted them to arrest kids. And they said, no, I'm not arresting this kid. This is your job. You take care of the kid. And this is overlooked, and we are quick to blame school resource officers and school police officers when they exist in systems that aren't necessarily, shall we say, harmonious in their perception of themselves. So we'll often see a bashing of school police officers or school resource officers or security guards as not having intense, intimate knowledge of how kids think, when in fact they do, and that understanding may inform others. We also know that some school resource officers are a whole lot more accessible to parents than guidance counselors or school administrators. So race plays a role, as does class, in all of these factors too, and as we're thinking about too. It's a complicated picture is the key thing I hope you'll take away. But from some of the data, it disproportionately affects some kids more than others.
Thank you all. Just a quick anecdote. When we did the school resource officer study nationally, we were in one principal's office and the principal was telling us that what they saw as a best practice. And they said anytime a parent was coming to the school and they thought the conversation might be difficult, they instructed the school resource officer to meet the parent in the parking lot, walk them to the principal's office, and then stand outside the principal's office during the time of the conversation, because they thought it would go much better that way. So as you've been hearing, that we have issues on both sides, on the school resource officer side, but also on the school administrator side. Other questions?
I just want to add to that. Boston no longer suspends kindergarten to third grade students. And when that happened, I can't tell you how many teachers and admins were like asking, what are we going to do? What do you mean what we're going to do? We need to provide the supports and resources that the students need instead of suspensions. It was not working.
One last point on that. I don't know what people expect, but we often hear teachers say, the kid's mental health issue is not my problem. I mean, who do we think is coming into our classrooms today? Perfect kids? I don't know. I don't know what happened to those expectations, but I think teachers are overstressed and have too many demands on them, and the lack of support services manifests in some of their impatience and lack of capacity to work with kids.
Other questions? Maddrey, comments?
Yeah, it's interesting because you think of the space and time in a caring young adult in someone's life. And I think in the school system, it's very easy for the students to identify that, but it's not often recognized by the administration. And sometimes who's ever closest to the young adults can almost seem punitive to the other adults, and unfortunately in a space and time where liability rules the day. And as a Northeastern grad, I didn't get there easily. I had my own issues with the NU police. A lot had to do with me. My aunt was my first grade teacher in a Black Catholic school. And so she wasn't necessarily the most caring adult, but definitely there's just a perspective, particularly culturally, and it impacts the way that students engage with systems. And I see it a lot because students are actually asked to assimilate in a lot of environments. And I don't know how we come to the place where they get their own voice that's authentic. But like you said, it doesn't stop by training people separately in a vacuum. And so I appreciate this dialogue. I know Harry and I worked years ago at a adjudicated youth program, and we did a lot with DYS youth who were trying to get educated while in custody. And there's just so many issues that in so many environments that young adults aren't in the traditional school setting, that are even harder for them to get resources. So,
Maddrey, do you mind? So this isn't a question; it's more of a comment. And there's a lot of comments about training tonight, and I think that it's, I think we all can agree, or at least there's some consensus that training is a big, or lack of training is a major thing, a major issue that needs to be addressed, whether it's from law enforcement or from SROs. But it's reminding me of a colleague of mine said something to me a long time ago, and it stuck with me. But we have to remind ourselves when we talk about training, or even the need for training, that training itself is not practice change, right? So the need is certainly there for training, and certainly from a qualitative standpoint, the type of training in which we hope would benefit SROs and law enforcement or what have you is important to note. But I think the other piece is just making sure that it's not, again, we're not stopping there and saying just training alone or even better training is going to necessarily have the intended impact in which, or outcomes in which we hope. I think it's an extension of that. It's training. It's also having evaluative and accountability measures post-training that ensure that the training is actually working, right? Those types of things have to happen. And so it's not only just a matter of making sure that our these staff are trained properly, but also that post-training, we're ensuring that there's actually practice change that's actually taking place.
May I jump in to say something to follow up on what Harry says? I couldn't agree with you more, Harry. What we say at Strategies for Youth is training is necessary, but not sufficient. And if you do not have policies, as most law enforcement agencies do not when it comes to dealing with teenagers, there's very little to anchor that training on. Additionally, if you don't have a leader with a vision about what you want to see resulting from those interactions, are you there to correct or are you there to punish? I mean, if we truly commit to youth development, we're not going to throw kids out. We're going to keep them in and correct them, and as many as possible, to behave in the way we think benefits everybody and harms no one. But I find it really difficult with most law enforcement agencies to get to looking at policy changes or even to reviewing their own policies or how you evaluate or how you deploy officers. So I'm thrilled you raised that point.
Earlier, I think, Timothy, you were going to ask a question or make a comment. I think you're muted.
Hello,
Yeah.
how you doing?
Hi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all the speakers. I want to say my name is Tim Fitzgerald, Youth Police and Partnership Program Supervisor. I want to say, first of all, once again, thank everybody. I just want to say that when you're talking about these youth dialogues really help. And I want to say that when we do these dialogues, we do the interaction with police and youth, let the kids be the police officer, let the youth be the youth, and it really works out. My other concern, because I do go work in I go talk in the Boston Public Schools. I do have a concern. How can we support the schools and how can we support the community? Because when I go to these schools, how do you put kids that have trauma, mental illness, and have these challenges, issues, behavioral, and they put them all in one schools, like certain schools is in one schools. So now I'm taking it as you're already setting the resource officers up to fail. You're setting some of the teachers who don't have the training to fail, because you put all these kids in one schools and then you're trying to deal with it. How do we have a conversation with that? Because I just feel that they shouldn't be all in one schools. How can we help them? And Lisa, you just said something. A lot of schools do more discipline than develop. And we just need to help the schools more and give them more support. And also too, we do talk to the youth about, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. How can you be respectful on the other side too? You know, start putting yourself in a situation and having that relationship, that dialogue. So we do a lot of work with that.
That's great.
Lucinda or Roxanne, you want to comment or?
I guess from someone who's at a lot of special education meetings, I'm going to say the hard piece about your comment is the fact that certain programs are existing in certain schools. So there's certain schools that have particular autism programs, for example. So certain schools are going to have particular populations of students or kids with learning disabilities. So to your point, in terms of maybe you might be seeing a certain subset or particular student populations in certain schools from a special education lens, some of our some of our schools have all of the BPS schools are not inclusion programs, one. So some are inclusion and some still have separate programs. So you are putting people with certain diagnoses in particular school buildings because of particular services that they should be accessing in those particular school buildings. So that's one piece of the answer. And the fact that when we get to like the high school levels, students are able to choose what schools they go to. So I think that also impacts it as well. And Boston does not really have what we call neighborhood schools. So a lot of our students are going across the city to schools.
Just to follow up, a lot of the schools that I was mentioning in the network are those schools. Actually, all of them are. So Ostagai High is the school that focuses on recovery for young people. College Bound Dorchester does GED prep, but then also does a lot of violence prevention. Bridge Over Troubled Waters does education, but they do housing. So yes, and I completely understand your point. And I would say that's why it was so important for us to tackle it as a network and not just looking at it from the adults' point of view, but also asking the young people what their point of view was and how did they want to tackle it. And the surprising thing is that sometimes the young people, and of course I wouldn't tell the adults this, but the young people had the jump on the adults. So the young people would identify what the problem was. And I would talk to the young people first, get the information from them, and then I go to the adults and say, hey, so the young people are saying that this might be an issue that's coming up. How can we work on it together as a network? And you're right. It's that comment is should be validated because some schools do have a lot of young people that have a lot of overlapping challenges, but the hope is that by having really great support systems specifically for those schools and by all of us working together, that we'll be able to support those young people. A thing with the network was if a young person didn't find success at one of the organizations, we had a warm referral, warm handoff MOA at the beginning of the year, which meant that if, for example, in Youth Build, we had a young woman who wasn't really enjoying and wanted to move to another program, we could give a call and they could find hopefully something that better matched what they were looking for and to ensure their success in that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Thank you for your responses. And I'll let Jack in, but I would just say, this is the difficulty of it, that you have dialogues, that community norms don't necessarily change because of legislation, but the two together in an informed way makes a huge impact. The problem is it's not always done in that format. So I want to thank everybody today. I want to continue the conversation. I want to acknowledge Jordan, this perception that the community, not only young adults, need to be paid for their time, and it needs to be equitable, as if it was for someone of prestige, in theory, getting an honorarium, because their information and what the community is giving is just as valuable. So thank you for that comment. And I'm gonna leave it to Jack because he's brought me into the space and I appreciate this space and it works for me.
Thank you, Maddrey, and thanks to the panelists. Thanks to Lisa, to Roxanne, to Lucinda. This has been a wonderful conversation. I encourage you all to continue it. All of the folks that are associated with the Institute for Race and Justice continually meet and try to deal with these challenges and try to listen and try to hear what's happening and what barriers are being put in people's way and trying to have these conversations or construct these trainings. And I have to do a plug for our next session that we'll be doing as part of this series is February 23rd. It's February 23rd, and we're going to continue the conversation around police and youth partnerships. And we'll be talking specifically about the program that you heard about here that Harry spoke about, the Youth Police Partnership Program. It's a long-standing and successful program in Boston that could serve as a model for other jurisdictions. And then we'll have a last session on April 27th. We'll look at race and immigration and how that plays itself out with law enforcement. And so we're going to continue this conversation, and all these conversations are going to include community voices, academic voices, as many voices as we can. So I thank you all for your time, and thank you all for participating in this conversation. Let's thank the panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a
Take care,
great
y'all.
night.
Night. Good night.